So as you can see, I just woke up, and apparently, let me move this out of the way. Apparently, it's been 6 months. Been half a year since I've been gone. Literally. Dang. This desk is like a little bit of a mess. Seems dusty as heck. Well, at least I got this monitor. Let's see if it even works. Does this seem to... Oh, this still powers on. I think I know what I'm going to be talking about today. Hi, Kareeb here. I know I've been sleeping for about 5 months, but hey, at least I'm back and not 6 feet in a ditch. You know what? To really ease my way back in here, why don't I give you all just a little bit of a story? A story about America's favorite thing ever: capitalism. You see, back in 1976, there was a young man by the name of Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and, what was his name again? Oh yeah, the forgotten one, Robert Wayne. These would go on to create the company Apple Computer Incorporated. Nobody knows why, but it wasn't like Ragnarok was an option for a name of a company. Shortly after creating the company, they would go on to create their first computer, the Apple I. It was wooden and looked like a poorly made science project. And all of the models of these computers that still exist today were actually handmade by Jobs and Wozniak themselves, sold at the perfect price of $666.66. Why?
Because they like numbers. They still sold 200 of them.
Regardless of what may have happened here, the real transition came when they released the Apple II in 1977, and rather than having them in handmade wooden cases, they actually looked pretty good and were more of a plastic case, more like an actual computer case, with two floppy disks and even a color monitor, combined with the organized and open system design that was just so good that IBM, at the time, the king of the personal computer market, ended up copying that design for that IBM PC lineup. Pretty interesting. Can I also mention that the early Apple logo is actually supposed to be a representation of Apple's CRT screens, because back then they were known to be probably one of the only companies to have pioneered the color CRT screen. So that's pretty interesting to know. Already, Apple is off to a great start with both of their computers beginning to become major successes. This, followed with the release of the Apple III, led to the overall best time for Apple. Little did they know about the complicated ups and downs that lie ahead. In January 22nd, 1983, the Apple Lisa was available for a whopping $9,995. However, because of the lack of success and the lack of people who actually cared about buying it, the price dropped down to a whopping $6,995. Steve Jobs then goes to convince a Pepsi guy by the name of John Scully, who was eventually won over to be the new CEO after he asked the legendary question: do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to take a chance and change the world?
Nah, I want to be a farmer.
Steve Jobs ultimately quits the very company that he had been working on after a dispute about the price of one of America's most revolutionary home computers. That computer would release on January 24th, 1984. The Macintosh. While nowadays it's well known and popular in pop culture, the Macintosh was well known for not doing well sales wise. This was mainly due to the very expensive 2,495 price tag that was placed onto it, and it didn't even have a lot of software to go with it either. It was more bare bones than even a brand new MacBook today. While Apple was beginning to face a dark path, Steve Jobs was just lit. He was just doing really well. He was going on to create Next Incorporated, a company that makes stupidly expensive computers that was for students and for workplaces. Either these workplaces had a crap ton of money for the price points that they were selling, or I don't know. I don't know.
Hey, at least the inventor of the internet used them to create the internet, which was probably the second biggest mistake he made, other than spending $10,000 on a PC.
With the money for Next Incorporated, he begins to go ahead and buy the animation division of Lucasfilm, the company that worked on Star Wars, and create Pixar.
Huh. So that's how Lightyear was created.
Now, around the late 80s, things start to get a little bit confusing. Some computer lines are continued and discontinued, some of them are just really confusing, so I'm just going to skim over this part of the history. But hey, they got into a lot of lawsuits, so that's interesting. Then in came Apple's worst computer in 1989 with the Macintosh Portable. It was heavy, fat, and had a weird trackball for a mouse. And the worst part was is that it didn't even have a backlight, which meant that the screen was practically pretty dim unless you were to put it in direct light. So, to no one's surprise, this one didn't sell well at all. In the 90s, this is where things started to look a lot like the Apple today. Even though they were still in a lot of financial trouble, they were beginning to take things like the PowerBook in 1991 and so on, taking steps that, although still need a little bit of work, were going to go a long way. But there is still a long way to go before Apple, we know today, pops up and becomes recognizable. In 1993, Apple begins to deliver the Power Macs. These Macs, rather than being some random processor from Motorola, uses the PowerPC chips also produced by Motorola and IBM. And then there's the Newton PDA, which let's just pretend that doesn't exist. Then in came a rare and interesting Mac, the 20th anniversary Mac. This all-in-one design and LCD flat panel display, which was new for the company at the time, costed as much as a messed up Toyota. That same year, in 1997, Steve Jobs makes a return after Apple buys Next Computers and the OS and software that it ran on. Eventually, in 1999, we got something similar to the Macs that we know of with the release of the first iMac in 1999, followed with the iBooks, PowerBooks, and PowerMac G3s. 2007 and onward, we'd see the iPhone lineup, and that would be the pinnacle of Apple, as to this day, people still buys iPhones regardless of the model. And then we have the Apple Watch, Siri, and so on.
And then here we are now, talking to you through the front camera of an iPhone. Now, I gotta say, usually when it comes to the history that goes behind these companies, they're pretty overrated or underrated, with Apple kind of being one of those that are kind of underrated. We usually take these brand new fancy iPhones for granted when we forgot that just 10 years ago, stuff was pretty different. You know, the iPhone didn't even exist back then. It was like, what, the iBook clamshell, you know, the one that looked like a clam. So I guess what I can say here is that there is a lot of history behind these companies. Most of the companies that go up have a reason for going up, though that would require a little bit more analyzation on my part and more research on my part to figure out why. But in general, they just made products that were more of a quality type than a quantity type. And seeing Apple's ecosystem now, pretty cool. Now, care for an apple?